Welcome. I'm Bob Lagama, President of the Council for Community of Democracies, and welcome to the venue of our host, IFES, one of my favorite democracy promotion organizations in the world. Thanks for coming out in this frigid Washington weather, and those of you that are watching online probably have the advantage of being in a warm place and not having to go out into this frigid weather. Anyhow, if you are watching online, you can submit questions at any time by emailing them to tmoton, M-O-T-O-N, tmoton @ifes.org. You can find this email address on the video screen below, and we ask that all members of the audience state their name and affiliation when asking a question. Really, this is a great privilege for me to be moderating this program with new friends and old. Matthew Hebert from Canada has come down here just for this occasion. Matthew is a curriculum expert who's worked on democracy education programs overseas in a number of places. Augusta Featherston of IFES, Ramona Kastman of the Organization of American States, and Lee Arbitman of Street Law, one of the premier democracy education, civic education organizations in the world. Let me just provide a little context for our own interest in this subject. We came into this at the founding of the Community of Democracies in 2000. At that time, the foreign ministers of more than 100 countries came together in Warsaw, Poland, and decided, for the first time in history, to talk about their interests in promoting, advancing, consolidating democracy around the world. The product of those discussions was the Warsaw Declaration. And in that declaration, there was clear awareness that at the foundation of any promotion of democracy, there had to be deep changes in culture, because it was understood that by involving a broad spectrum of the population in transitions to democracy for the first time, when those populations had been subject to authoritarian rule, there had to be a process of education, a process of transformation, a process of democratization, so that a broad spectrum of the population was involved in that new democracy, involved and participating actively, not only in voting, but also in every other aspect of democracy, making their voices heard, lobbying for their positions, demonstrating, all of those activities that go with free speech, free assembly in a democracy. And there needed to be, it was clear, a process of education to make this happen. There had to be a dialogue that involved the people that democracy was all about, dialogue between them and their governments. CCD then made a decision to consider education for democracy a priority, and we held 3 international conferences at the Rockefeller Brothers Conference Center in Pocantico, New York. And we there developed some strategies which culminated in the idea that there should be national plans and that there should be stakeholders involved if it was to truly be a way of promoting an understanding for democracy and a participation in democracy. Our guru in all of this was a South African professor of law, David McCoy Mason, who had energetically used really the street law ideas to promote democratic development in apartheid South Africa, which wasn't easy and was extremely dangerous at times. Anyhow, David developed the idea of the national plans and the involvement of stakeholders, which meant civil society, representatives of parents and teachers and education officials, who would ideally sit around a table and discuss what should go into a curriculum on democracy in a particular country, with the understanding that every country would be a bit different because of their culture and history and the realities on the ground. Well, our organization considered it critical to persuade government policymakers about the need to embed education for democracy in school curricula. And we had a big breakthrough about 3 years ago when the government of Mongolia became the chair of the Community of Democracies, and it decided that its highest priority during a two-year period of its chairmanship would be to promote education for democracy. The Mongolians considered it critical to the success of their new democracy that there should be this kind of education. And they considered it their job to try to involve others in developing successful programs of this kind. I recall when the president of Mongolia came to the United States a few years ago, he quoted from the great Democrat Genghis Khan, who once said, you can conquer the world on horseback, but you really have to dismount to govern it. And that contains some element of understanding of what democracy is all about, I think. Anyhow, Mongolia pursued this very vigorously at the United Nations and caused there to be a resolution passed in the UN General Assembly unanimously on the importance of democracy education and calling upon UN specialized agencies to support this, which means that there is the potential for support of UNESCO, UNDP, and other UN specialized agencies. It also called upon the Secretariat of the United Nations to keep track of what was going on in this field so that there could be some cross-fertilization of ideas and encouragement that member states would have from the collection of this kind of data. The UN General Assembly resolution in 2012 was followed by a more recent UNESCO resolution, also reiterating that the importance of this. Mongolia also organized a planning session in Ulaanbaatar, which you helped organize, Mr. Gansuk, and a follow-up conference that Matthew here attended in New Delhi for Asia, bringing together a dozen Asian countries and experts from the region and officials from ministries of education to talk about how democracy education could be advanced in Asian countries. We followed that conference with our own gathering in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, where we drafted what we called the Charlottesville Declaration, which we thought was a good roadmap for governments to follow if they wanted to fulfill their objective of installing democracy education. We were fortunate to have a grant from the United Nations Democracy Fund for the Charlottesville Conference and for pilot programs that we just concluded in Colombia and in Ghana to look at what they were doing and to try to draw lessons from those activities. And also, finally, we published a handbook on democracy education with about 20 case studies from around the world of interesting examples of what could be done. That's available outside. Please take a copy before you leave. It also contains the UN resolution. So the handbook was a culmination of the process, and I think of this event as a kind of way of launching it by making you aware and others of its existence. And want to also call upon anybody that has any reactions to the handbook or any good ideas about best practices to let us know. And let me give you our address, email address, ccdinfo@ccd21.org. We're looking for ideas. We're looking for reactions to some of the case studies and some of the ideas that are in this handbook, and we invite you to send your thoughts to that address. Let's proceed now with the panel, and begin with Matthew Hebert, our Canadian friend who has just brought his Canadian weather with him to Washington. Matthew.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's really an honor for me to be here and to speak with you a little bit about the process of working collectively with some of these people around the room on democracy education. I'm an education consultant working mostly in international development, and I have a kind of a specialization in social transformation. So whenever I have the opportunity, I try to focus my effort on education for democratization, sustainability, social justice, and these kinds of things. And the approach that I always end up advocating, in whatever the issue, is pretty simple. Practice what we preach. So in the case of democracy, if we want to support democracy through education, then we really need to look seriously at the extent to which our education systems truly embody democratic values and principles. My entry point into this conversation today came through some work that I did with the Community of Democracies during the term of Mongolia's chairmanship of the organization. With support from the Canadian government, we launched a small project working with Canadian and Mongolian specialists to develop a curriculum framework on education for democracy. We wanted the framework to be internationally relevant, and so this meant that it couldn't be too directive or too heavy on the content side, because each country's context and their own democracies are all quite different. So as a result, the work ended up developing more as an approach or a conceptual framework for democratizing the schooling process, rather than any kind of conventional curriculum. Essentially, the framework that we developed looks at education as a process of enculturation, and it problematizes the idea of learning culture in school to explore how we might better infuse democratic values and principles into that process. I believe the document is already available on the IFES website in conjunction with today's session, so it should be at the bottom of the screen for those of you watching online. This work has been well received, I think, because it tries to take a somewhat more aggressive approach to the issue than what we've historically seen in most civic education programs. It forces some very challenging questions about how we practice education. So let's talk about that. Before getting into democracy education, it's worth taking an honest look at the realities of mass schooling and to use the lens of democracy to evaluate the way that we practice education. Now, we could talk about this at any level of the system, from the very top of the system down to the school district boards or the school management, or right down to the classroom level. But for the purposes of today's session, I think it makes the most sense to focus on the experience of the children. So bear with me while I walk you through a little thought experiment. Imagine a child learning in an authoritarian classroom versus a child learning in an open and participatory classroom. The child in the authoritarian classroom spends most of her day sitting, listening to lectures. She learns not to ask questions or to stand out. She learns a respect for authority that's largely based on fear, and with this, a discipline which is based on rules and punishments. She learns, over time, to be passive, quiet, obedient, and complacent. The child in the open and participatory classroom, on the other hand, cultivates a very different way of interacting with the world around her. She spends her days actively engaged in asking and answering questions. She's solving problems, working collaboratively, and taking initiative with others. This has huge consequences for the way that she develops as a person, and the extent to which she becomes willing and able to put forward opinions, to take initiative, to organize with her peers, and to think and act autonomously. Now, having said this, the reality for most students these days, and certainly most in North America, is probably something quite different from either of these scenarios. For many, the schooling experience is characterized by bells, books, and boredom. Although the official timetable has different subjects scheduled, the experience of each subject is remarkably similar. Bell rings, sit down, listen to teacher, take notes, write test. Bell rings, get up, leave, repeat, go home, do homework, sleep, repeat, right? Their world is structured in a way that leaves very little space for curiosity, for genuine creativity, for critical reflection, or for initiative. Everything is scheduled and scrutinized. The way in which students experience the different subjects in school throughout the day ends up having a far more formative power than the explicit contents of those subjects. It doesn't matter all that much what subject they're studying officially, because the most powerful lesson taught in school has nothing to do with those subjects. It's the method. And when I say the method here, I'm not referring only to the instructional strategies of the teacher. I'm talking about the overall approach to education, and with this, all of the many factors that comprise students' daily experiences. The educators in the audience will recognize what I'm talking about here as the so-called hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum is a bit elusive, but it's widely acknowledged, at least in critical circles, to contribute more to the political socialization of students than any aspect of the formal curriculum. The trouble with the hidden curriculum is that it operates beneath the surface. The term is used to refer to things which students learn, or rather pick up, in school, which aren't taught explicitly. Its nature makes them difficult to pin down and articulate because it operates largely in the tacit domain. This kind of learning is more akin to what we usually think of as socialization than education in the colloquial sense. And as a result, our educational jargon around teaching processes and learning outcomes don't handle the hidden curriculum very well. While we can readily brainstorm ideas about the factors that might be involved in teaching the hidden curriculum, the list quickly becomes so long that it's hard to know how to even approach the project of reorienting the hidden curriculum to make it something more positive. It's just that we're not used to thinking about teaching in these terms. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I first want to talk a little bit about conventional curricula. The conventional approach to curriculum development is to frame curriculum either around a set of contents to be taught or around a set of objectives. But these two approaches end up being fairly similar in practice because when objectives are used, the heavy emphasis tends to be on knowledge and content-based objectives. This fits with our colloquial concept of teaching because content matter feels like something that one party can impart directly to another. All the teacher needs to do is deliver a skillful lecture, and the empty vessels in the room will slowly get filled up with their wisdom, right? Much of what has historically been called civic education is consistent with this approach. And this is what I refer to as education about democracy. It treats democracy primarily as a body of contents to be learned. But knowing about democracy does not translate directly into engaged democratic citizenship. Even if we successfully complement that with teaching skills like critical thinking, media literacy, and debate, students may still graduate from school feeling disengaged or disinclined to participate actively in democratic life. So it's clear that if we want to go beyond education about democracy, we need to get past this idea that democracy is just a body of content. If we want to leverage the real power of education to support democratization, then we need to look at the deeper layer of learning and development that I referred to as the hidden curriculum. We have to confront this hidden curriculum and figure out how to change it. Since the hidden curriculum is learned experientially, we need to look at the schooling experience much more comprehensively than we usually do. And to do this, we need to start teasing apart that long list of factors that comprise students' daily experiences. It's because of these factors, these many factors, that hammer against students hour after hour, day after day, year after year, as they're immersed in schooling. These factors condition students, and students become habituated to them until slowly they are internalized as assumptions, perspectives, and expectations about what's normal, what's good, and who they themselves are as people. We need to ask what values and principles are embodied in the different policies and procedures, in the way that we do assessment, in the way teachers give instructions, in the physical layout of our classrooms, in the lunchroom, in our discipline systems, and in the way the school day is conducted, and so on. And as we do this, we need to keep in mind that every little aspect of students' daily experience has political importance. If it's not contributing to a democratic political socialization, then it's contributing to some other kind of political socialization. And it doesn't matter much what other kind of political socialization that is, whether authoritarian or apathetic or something else entirely. If it's not democratic, then in some way it's anti-democratic. We need to think about schools as being cultural institutions and the primary sites of socialization. These are the main public institutions in which we should be working to establish a culture of democracy. Above all, this means that we need to be providing with our students with experiences being immersed in a democratic context and creating the relevant kinds of mindsets and expectations. Schools also need to provide opportunities to practice the kinds of things which we expect citizens to do in a democracy: caring about issues, developing well-reasoned perspectives, taking initiative, thinking and acting autonomously, taking ownership for themselves and responsibility for their actions, organizing themselves to resolve issues, formulating opinions and discussing them respectfully, and so on. In short, we need to start looking at education as a practice of doing democracy. I worked in Egypt for several years, leading up to and following the revolution and the overthrow of Mubarak. The situation there has been really troubling, and I was talking about it with a good Egyptian friend recently. He characterized the situation there very well. He said, "It all comes down to education. We simply haven't learned how to disagree with one another, how to discuss things and work through our differences, and so simple disagreements regularly deteriorate into violence. This is one of the consequences of an authoritarian education system. You can talk about democracy all you want in a context like that, but until there's space to practice doing democracy in education and developing skills like debate and deliberation, it's really difficult to have a fully functional democracy." As critical as I am about mass schooling in general, I'm increasingly optimistic about the exciting work being done in different pockets of our education systems around the world. It's not surprising that the most exciting work is often being done by civil society, but occasionally we find inspiration even at the top of the education system. One thing that you'll notice as you're reading the Best Practices Manual that Bob mentioned earlier is that there's a keen attention in all of those to an alignment and a congruence between the substantive contents of what's being talked about and the processes that are being used to help students learn them. Nonetheless, this task of reorienting the hidden curriculum to make education more democratic is very complex. We're talking about changing an entire system, changing a culture, with a huge range of interrelated factors. As inspired as we might be, it's hard to know where to start. So to close, I'd like to come back around to mention once again the curriculum framework that I worked on last year with my colleagues in Mongolia. That framework outlines a systematic approach for identifying the different factors, and it provides some suggestions for how to reorient them to become more democratic. I'd like to encourage anyone who's interested to check it out, and also to provide us with any feedback that you might have about the approach and how we might refine it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. We'll move on to Augusta now. Let's hear something about young people.
Well, we heard a lot from Matt here, so, but I'll just keep my remarks fairly brief. I wanted to talk a little bit about the way that IFES engages in youth work and the importance of that work to our core mission as an organization. So as you know, IFES work around the world focuses on advancing good governance and democratic rights by primarily by providing technical assistance to election officials, empowering citizens to engage in the political process so that underrepresented populations can have a voice in the way they are governed. For us, civic education is a vitally important component of this work, particularly in light of the fact that many of the countries where IFES works, the majority of the population can be considered youth by some measure. Though I think we can avoid the somewhat popular debate now, which is focused on strict definitions of youth and whether that's, 15 to 24 or up to 30 or what have you. Though I know that some people are very interested in defining it strictly. So anyway, furthermore, in some areas of the world where we work, schools and ministries are under pressure to focus on science, technology, engineering, mathematics, so-called STEM education, to the exclusion, I think, of traditional civic education courses and humanities courses. And while science and technology STEM curriculum is critical, the increased attention they receive sometimes does result in exclusion of the civic education curriculum from schools. And of course, this has a direct impact on development of individuals as active citizens, as research suggests that civic education in schools and community-based programs remain the most effective avenue through which we teach our young people how to participate in the political process and in community life and affairs. So in the context of IFES work, our IFES youth-specific work, our focus is then providing programming that positively impacts this protracted transitional time of life during which an individual's relationship with their government changes from passive to active. And this, of course, is marked by a milestone event, the age of enfranchisement. In different countries, that event occurs at different ages, different times of life. But whatever it is, there is this one moment where, before which someone cannot participate actively in their government by casting a ballot, and after which they can, and then they have a voice that's recognized in selecting their government. We feel that this approach ensures that young people can participate in a meaningful way, both before and after enfranchisement. So for citizens or youth participants in IFES pre-voting programs, our work focuses on creating a culture of engagement through democracy camps, mock elections, and other civic education courses, both formal and non-formal, outside of the schools. For those who have obtained the right to vote, IFES provides training, incentives, tools, opportunities for new voters to vote, voter education, and advocate and tools so that participant or tools where people can advocate for positive change within their communities. So woven throughout both prongs of this bifurcated approach is a focus on being able to put skills into practice. So Matt here talked about experiential learning, and we incorporate this into our programs as well. We've found in our democracy camp curriculum in Kyrgyzstan, there is an element, a curricular element, which is a post-camp project. So students come, they participate in workshops and lectures and other activities during the camp, but then they themselves identify an issue that they'd like to work on in their communities after they return home. This is important because it affords people the opportunity to use the skills that they've spent some time developing. Similar, in our formal civic education courses in Georgia, there is a post. Students are compelled to put together student action plans that they then carry out after the course has finished. And again, in this way, they've identified an issue they want to address, and then following the course, do it. The goal of all of our programming is then to make sure that citizens are active in their communities after the program ends. So after the course is finished, the important part is, what are you doing then with that knowledge? Where is it taking you? What is the greater impact on the community around you? I could talk more about our specific programming examples, but I feel like we may get to those during the Q&A session. So I'd like to stop there and maybe pass back to Bob.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Augusta. I want to call on Romina Kussman, who of the Organization of American States. OAS has done a great deal in this field over the years to stimulate a dialogue among ministries of education in Latin America, in the Americas in general. Romina?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I also congratulate CCD for organizing this, because it's very strange, if I can say this, that we have opportunities to discuss about this topic. So to find opportunities, to find forums in which we can discuss, debate from a theoretical and practical perspective, I think this is a very important thing, and so I thank you for the invitation and for opening this room for this. I will divide this brief presentation in two parts. One is the description of what we do at the OAS, and the other is some ideas, some trends that I will speak not on behalf of the OAS. I will speak as a professional working in this field for some years. I want to make this distinction because, as you know, sometimes one's perspective and one's experience maybe it's not the opinion of an entire organization. The OAS is composed by 34 member states, which is all the member states from the Americas, with the exception of Cuba. And the program I coordinate is the Inter-American Program on Education for Democratic Values and Practices. It's a program that was adopted in 2005 within the framework of the 5th Ministerial Meeting of Ministries of Education in Trinidad and Tobago. And this program was a response, a reaffirmation of the commitment of member states regarding the Inter-American Democratic Charter. You know, the Inter-American Democratic Charter was adopted in September 2001, and it was just the day of the terrorist attacks here in the U.S. So it has a significant value for not only, I think, for the Americas and also for the world, because of the specific time in which it was adopted. And that Inter-American Democratic Charter guides our organization and guides the member states. So our program is a reaffirmation of that. It's important to highlight that our program started with an advisory board of more than 40 experts from different countries of the Americas, and these experts decided or planned to organize the program in 3 components: research, information exchange and cooperation, and professional development. So based on that, we develop different activities with the support of member states. But we don't only work with ministries of education. We work with civil society organizations. We work with teachers. We work with the students. Depends on the activities that we carry out. I will mention some examples, but if you want to expand on the program, want further information, I invite you to visit our website, which is educadem.oas.org. We'll be around here if you want more information, and I can give you, or my colleagues also, we can give you our email so you can have further information. So within the professional development component, we develop online courses for teachers and policymakers on topics such as building democratic classrooms. And we have a Spanish version, which was first piloted in Peru with the Ministry of Education of Peru, the Ministry of Education of Argentina, and the National University of Distance Education of Spain, UNED. And also we have a Caribbean version of that course, which is important for you to know that even though we agree on what, or I don't know if we agree, but what democracy is, democracy has different features and different character in each of the country, because it has to do with the history, with the past history, with the recent history, and also what the country think that their future will be. So what country we want, what type of citizen we need. So that's the way I can say the countries define how they implement and how they call this education for democratic citizenship. So also we have online courses, for example, with Inter-American Development Bank on transparency, for teachers, promoting transparency and integrity, and also evaluation of policies and programs in education for democratic citizenship, which is very important because we can always think on how to define, how to implement programs, but the time, the problem comes when you want to evaluate. Not only because of systematization of experiences, because we like to report, but if we want to justify that we need more resources in this field that has few resources, we need to start learning how to evaluate and how to show the others how relevant, which are the impacts of this field. We also prepare publications such as policy brief to stimulate the dialogue among policy makers on topics of evaluation, on topics of human rights and the importance of human rights education for promoting living together. Also, the collaboration between civil society organizations and governments in the development of policies and programs in civic education. And also, we have online bulletins. We use these publications to promote dialogue. That's what we do. We promote dialogue. We don't find to promote, it's not building consensus among the countries. It's just provoking the discussion among the different stakeholders so they can find their own consensus and try to position some topics in the agenda. We have also, the third and last component is information exchange and cooperation. And we implemented horizontal cooperation missions that consisted of technical assistance activities. We implemented 2 rounds, and we have more than 57 institutions participating in 19 horizontal cooperation missions between 16 countries. So what we do is we provide technical and financial assistance for different types of institutions, always involving one governmental institution for cross-fertilization. So they learn, we don't say good practices, we say that promising experiences that we have here, they can be transferred with adaptation and with training to other people. So through these missions, we try to build capacity. And in these missions, let me tell you, that we have seen, in the 2 rounds, the first one was 2009, 2010, and the second one, 2011, 2012, we have seen how the civil society increased its influence in the transferring of knowledge. Civil society is more and more a big player. It's increasing its importance, its role in the transference of knowledge. So now governments are cooperating with civil society and want the experience of civil society, for developing their programs. So this is a very important thing to bear in mind. And we have a recent development that we hope that it will be launched soon, that it's a matrix on civic and citizenship education, where we are, it's like one of the people that we consulted for this said it's kind of Google. Well, it's a kind of Google of civic and citizenship education in the Americas, with a virtual library for democratic classrooms and also a virtual mapping of policies, programs, and experiences. Thank you. And just to finish with this second part, I will do it in 1 minute, is that at the theoretical level, we can say from 2005, 2006 until now, we are going through a process which is a change of paradigm from civic education to citizenship education. And this changing of paradigm that I think it's really taken into consideration by governments. It's because now a lot of reforms, curriculum reforms in civic and citizenship education are taking place. So I think it's good to study this change, this shift in the paradigm, and also to consider other variables, mainly in Latin America, for this changing of the paradigm, which is the economic growth. And economic growth leads to social mobilization and increase of political participation. So schools, government has to deal, and other institutions has to deal with this new scenario. It's not just democracy. Now it's democratization and how you can channel this through the institutions. Having, for example, in Latin America, the experience that sometimes participation goes out. It's not channeled within the institution. And second, that there are different regional fora, not only the OAS, many different regional fora, and also at the world level. For example, UNESCO has just launched the Education for Global Citizenship. So many people is talking about this. So it's a very good time to continue discussing. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Romina. Now we'll bat cleanup. Lee Arbitman of Street Law, one of the organizations that has experience in working in this field in many countries around the world for many years and has been extremely successful, and even working in the United States on these issues.
The batting cleanup idea is the idea of using a warm weather metaphor to sort of help us with today's temperatures. And also, I guess, part of the metaphor is if there's any runners left on base, when you get to me, I'm supposed to knock them in. I don't exactly know how that translates. But as for me, it's 3 weeks until pitchers and catchers report, and I'm looking forward to that. So on your way out to the fantastic brownies, if you're here in person, are a series of slides. And if you're here through the webcast, these same slides are available for free download. And they will give you some reminders about what it is that this presentation is about. I'm going to be brief because I'm last and you have other things that you want to do. I want to make sure that you know why we have this weird name, street law, which can be misleading, I think, to people. We don't deal with traffic law, actually, at all. Justice O'Connor, when she first met us, said, "Oh, that's so nice that you teach young people about traffic law." Well, that's actually not what we do. She really learned what street law was in Eastern Europe when she was working in democratizing countries there and saw examples of our work in those countries. Give you a little bit of a very quick history, because street law started right here in Washington, D.C., just over 40 years ago, when 4 law students worked together to develop some innovative, student-centered lessons about practical law and public policy. Both they're Georgetown law students, and they worked at Eastern and at Wilson High School. And as they tried these lessons out and found a lot of success with them because law lessons are engaging and they're relevant, the kids said, "Oh, you want to teach us street law?" The law students hadn't actually figured out what this was. It was just maybe sort of preventive law or something like that. But the street law name stuck, and it's what we use in the United States. It doesn't translate very well in other countries, and many other people call it everyday law or you and the law or practical law. But a variety of names. But as you'll see in a few minutes, there are some common characteristics to these street law programs throughout the U.S. and around the world. So the Georgetown program, which started 40 years ago, continues to this day, and Georgetown law students teach a law course in every D.C. public high school. There are now 70 other law schools in the U.S. that have law student teaching programs and 50 more around the world. So significant numbers of lawyers and lawyers-to-be are involved with street law. And the beneficiaries of it are not only the young people who are in those classes, but also we've done research that shows that law students who get involved in democracy education programs stay involved in their careers at a much higher level in pro bono and public interest kinds of work, which is important because they're significant people in many countries, and their commitment to democratic practice is something that stays with them. And as an organization, we try to continue to give them opportunities to do that. The reason we exist is because knowledge about democracy and commitment to democratic practice isn't transferred through the water supply. It doesn't come down to us through the gene pool. It has to be taught, and it has to be taught with some intentionality and with some intensity. And as Matt has said, it's not only taught through the formal curriculum, but it's taught by modeling and through the informal or hidden curriculum as well, which makes it a challenge for sure. So these law school programs have been sort of the launching points for us, especially in other countries, of democracy education programming. In the U.S. and in other countries, street law also works with teachers. And in the U.S., we work with high school social studies teachers. We bring them to the Supreme Court and Georgetown Law School every summer for the last 19 summers to teach them about the court. The majority of the current justices, as well as Justices O'Connor and Souter, have been directly involved in that program, and John Roberts and I developed that when he was a young and not so famous lawyer, and I was younger and still not famous lawyer. But he's continued to be kind of our rabbi on the court, which has been terrific for us. In 1986, just about 15 years after we got our start here in D.C. and around the U.S., a significant thing happened, which Bob has referred to, which is the street law folks in the United States meeting David McCoy Mason in South Africa before Nelson Mandela's release from prison, actually. And street law in South Africa has become an important part of the new South Africa. If you go to South Africa, street law materials are available in English, Afrikaans, and Zulu. They're an inclusive sort of program. And that's the first of the 40 countries that we've now worked in around the world. Again, as I mentioned, in many cases with law schools as sort of the base for the support, lawyer-teacher partnerships. So wherever you go in the world and see street law programs, there should be three things that are the characteristics of those programs that give them their power to change people and institutions. And if you think about it on the slides, it's represented as a triangle. But a better way to think about it is a three-legged stool. Because if you think about a three-legged stool, if one leg isn't there, you fall over. Not like a four-legged stool where with one leg out, you still got three you can sit up. So the three-legged stool, each of the three legs is important. And so the three legs of the street law stool, that word is sort of unfortunate in some way, I understand that. But it just now has sort of become obvious to me what the multiple meanings are. But my kids are young, we're learning about homonyms, so stool's okay. First of all the street law programs focus on practical elements of law, democracy, and human rights. They're practical. They're relevant. Before I went to law school, I was a math teacher. I love teaching math. I think math is really important. But when a kid in a math class asks you why it's important to learn about quadratic equations, even if there is an answer, there isn't an answer that will convince the kid who asks that question that quadratic equations are important. Whereas in a law class, people know that the law is important. It's relevant. Knowledge is power. They get it. So whatever it's missing, relevance is not missing. And adolescent learners are seeking relevance in their lives and seeking relevance in their curriculum. So this focus on law helps with that. The second leg of let's use the triangle. It seems like more appropriate for a mixed audience. Is really that street law focuses like a laser on developing the skills that enable young people to use their newly acquired knowledge. So you don't really develop the skill of advocacy by listening to someone talk. You learn that by talking. And in fact, young people, just like adults, talk themselves to understanding. And street law classes have young people engaged in well-organized activities where they develop advocacy skills, critical thinking, problem solving, and help talk themselves to understanding. The heavy intellectual lifting in a street law class, if you were at a glass door like this and looking in, would be young people actively involved in the learning, teachers and resource people facilitating it, but the intellectual heavy lifting is with the kids, as it should be. So democracy is not only what we teach about, but it's also how we teach. And that really echoes the point I think that Matt started the panel with. Finally, the street law programs all involve the community. Lawyers, law students, judges, police officers, they have an interest in democracy education, and they have a role in democracy education. Teachers can't do it by themselves, and we train lawyers, law students, judges, and police officers to work in classrooms in collaboration with teachers. We do that in the U.S., and we do it around the world. Over the years, we've done a lot of curriculum development. There's a high school textbook called Street Law, now in its 8th edition, published by McGraw-Hill. If you take a law class in a U.S. high school, that's going to be the book that you use. My children are petrified that they are at some point going to be in a law class that their dad's name is on it, and I will at that point have to hide the teacher's manual because it has the answers. It'd be completely unfair. But in other countries, we've worked with our South African partners where we really have a special relationship to develop Democracy for All, which is really a global set of lessons about democratic principles. And we're in the process of changing this old-fashioned thing called a book into a series of digital lessons that can be downloaded and also adapted with a cultural overlay as appropriate for the various countries in which we work. We've developed, if you're up to speed on your Arabic, Islam and Democracy with the Center for Islam, the study of Islam and Democracy, and scholars in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan. And this is a book similar to Democracy for All, except that democratic principles are taught interactively in the street law method and through the prism of Islam, which I think in the Middle East and North Africa is the appropriate way to work. That's really all I wanted to say today. Thanks for having me. They're very easy to find out more about us. Streetlaw.org is our website, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you have when we get to the question and answer part.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, and the other panelists. This is gives us a lot of food for thought and for questions. As a reminder, if you're watching online, you can submit your questions at any time by emailing them to losio@ifes.org. We ask that all members of the audience state their name and affiliation when asking a question. So we have some questions. Mr. Whitman.
May I interrupt you for just 1 second? The email address is actually tmoton, Tmoton, at ifes.org. Just
thank you.
Last minute change.
Thank you, Gusta. Yeah. Mr. Whitman, Dr. Whitman.
I'm Dan Whitman. Thank you very much. I'm Dan Whitman with American University. I'm so grateful to CCD for helping us join as an entire class from the School of International Service. You have all discussed education and culture, and Matthew used the term enculturation. When you talked about the hidden curriculum, I know you didn't mean it this way. It sounded somewhat sinister because we know that enculturation, the acquisition of the primary culture, is not always at the conscious level. It's sometimes at the unconscious level. You've all talked about, many of you talked about experiential learning and about the acquisition, how culture and education that are related but not the same. You're talking about the use of education to modify a culture. In your work on this, on the micro level, do you have any insights you can share on how learning actually happens? We know that enculturation is sometimes a process that happens between the mother and the infant. We don't need to do this as a psychology course, but when you're teaching street law and you held up the brochure, it's one thing to have a text and to, I hate to use the word preach, but to actually explain a behavior modification. It's quite another thing to actually become part of a person's consciousness. Does anybody have any insights on how that happens?
Yeah, I think John Dewey had a lot of insights on how it happened, and so we've known about it for a long time, although we may honor it in the breach to some extent. But people really learn by doing. So part of doing is talking, and part of it is also participating in activities that model democratic practice. So maybe to cite an obvious example, think about a class that is learning about how the justice system works through a lecture, as opposed to a class that prepares for and then presents a mock trial or a moot court, and has people from the justice system involved with them in that preparation and presentation and debriefing. One is obviously a lot more powerful. So I think some of this is really stuff that we've known for a long time, which is that you learn by doing, by talking, and it's not just what you learn and how you learn, but who you learn it with. And democracy education provides opportunities to get the who as well as the how and the what together.
Matthew?
Yeah, I was first the idea that came to my mind was Dewey as well, and he's sort of got an answer for everything, and he tackles this issue from cognitive theory through philosophy right down to the practice of teaching itself. We also can take lessons from the sociologists, from Durkheim all the way through to Bourdieu. They all talk about this process of socialization as a kind of a response to the environment around you. And so while while Dewey talks about it in one set of terms, we can also take clues from the sociologists and the anthropologists around how culture is learned, and we look at things like the visual environment, the linguistic environment, because, as we know, the language forms a kind of cognitive scaffolding by which we are able to conceive thought and abstract thought. And so the kinds of words that we use in our environment, the kind of labeling in the environment, and all sorts of things that are so subtle we don't generally pick up on them. The role modeling from not just parents but also teachers. And then I want to just reiterate again this idea of what students are practicing day after day. So if students are practicing sitting and listening, well, what are we expecting them to learn from that versus learning by doing, as Lee has mentioned? Okay.
Thank you. My name is Mariam Memar Sadeghi. I'm from an organization called Collaborative for Civic Education. We teach Iranians inside Iran civic education, human rights education, using e-learning tools which they access anonymously through an anonymous user ID. And we've worked with Matthew Hebert on some wonderful materials. My question is actually kind of a tangential one for Mr. Arbitman. In talking about the Middle East and North Africa, you mentioned that the appropriate way in is through Islam when talking about democracy. And as someone engaged with Iranians on a day-to-day basis who are almost vehemently anti the introduction of religious principles into the classroom, I think that, well, at the very least, it's questionable whether Islam is going to be the appropriate or the very democratic way into speaking about democracy for the whole region.
Might be that in some countries it's not the best way, but having it as a tool has been helpful in some places. You know, one of the things about democracy education that I'm almost certain everybody on the panel would agree with is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And I know, at least for street law, we never work in other countries without very close collaboration with NGO partners in that country. We don't teach any American law. This is not an ugly American approach at all. We have very close partnerships, and we see our role as providing the kind of technical support that will enable an NGO in a country to be empowered to run the programs that they develop with us. So in some countries it's been really helpful, and certainly we wouldn't force this on anybody, anywhere.
Good afternoon.
Gustavo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Robert, and thank you for putting this event together. I think it's very useful for us to get to know on projects and programs.
Let me just say that Gustavo is the coordinator for El Salvador of the chairmanship of the Community of Democracy.
Thank you. I have a quick question, perhaps for all of you. Have you ever encountered, I mean, I think it's a novel, education in general is a novel thing to promote and to fight for, but have you ever encountered when you are starting your programs in the field, like, for example, the relation on poverty and democracy? There are so many immediate needs of people in poor countries. They don't mind if they have an institute for freedom of access, information of freedom of access. So because they have more immediate needs, and how does such bring programs and ideas that help and contribute the idea of formal democracy with their governments, but in reality there are some other things that people really care less about it. They don't mind about the election day, for example, because if I don't work that day, I don't eat. And this is kind of the kind of questions that we really need to even start focusing on if we want to create citizens, or we want to really try to help them or include them in fighting for real democracy and not just formal democracy.
Please.
Thank you.
Augusta.
I think your question really speaks to the point that Lee was talking about, and I think we all made. You have to connect the relevance. So why is it important to vote for IFES? Well, it's important because in this way you exercise your ability to take part in government and have your voice be heard. And so when you're able to cast a ballot and elect a representative who is representative of your values, then the natural progression is that policies might be enacted or legislation changed, and down the line you do see an actual impact on someone's life. So, but you do have to make that point. Like, this is why this behavior has this outcome.
Also, I think we always look from top-down approach, and it's also good to have a bottom-up approach. And I was also going to refer to the first question, because when teaching civic and citizenship education, or whatever you want to call it, it gives you self-esteem, autonomy. These are so basic things that you need to move in your life to understand your rights, to exercise your rights. It's more than understanding government or practice citizenship. Go into a participative budget session no, it's strengthen yourself. So when you gain that, and when you can, for example, for teachers, I will explain my experience as a trainer of teachers in my country. In rural communities or rural poor communities, say, hey, it's exactly the picture you told us about, and you say no. Well, not no, but here's another vision, because through civic and citizenship education, you can allow your students to be free, to feel the freedom and to practice that and to change the things. It's difficult when they don't see it, but when you see the students changing things, starting by changing their life and how they conceive themselves, that I can do something, that's different. But for that, you also need the community engagement. If you don't have the engagement of community, if you don't have the engagement of school authorities, or if you are in the formal sector, well, that's another issue. But if you have community engagement, that's more easier.
I heard the question to be, who needs food and shelter needs that before they need a lesson about constitutionalism, and I think that's right. The one thing I can say is that street laws worked in countries that are very, very different in terms of economic development, and we have found that people are interested in these basic democratic principles from country to country. It doesn't matter that much, but certainly there's an immediacy of needs about the needs that you're raising. People need to eat and have shelter before they need a lesson on constitutionalism, or for example.
Yes, this gentleman here.
Hi, Mario Criffo from the Department of State. A number of you, particularly Romina, have talked about curriculum development initiatives that have then been rolled out on regional bases. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what challenges you've experienced in working with multiple national governments that have diverse concepts of what democracy is and what they expect to be taking place in their classrooms.
Thank you for the question. It's difficult. Well, not. I think one of the things that I didn't mention is that we don't pursue a specific definition of what is education for democracy, for example, from our program. So that is good because you can open, the floor for different conceptions, different definitions, so everybody can work with their own. But what I found in my experience of 3 years, from a personal perspective, is that there's a need to advance in this topic. There's a need to advance in this field, and there's a need to have promising practices. So when there's a gap between the policy and the practice, and everybody sees that. So how you bridge that gap is through learning experience of other, no matter the sector, sometimes no matter the country. Sometimes matter the country, but most of the times in my experience, it was very rich, to see different governments and different stakeholders, putting together ideas, because there's one interest to advance in the field. And also it depends on the mechanisms. For example, cooperation mechanisms, dialogue mechanisms. And so you discuss, and when you cooperate, you transfer knowledge, different modalities of transferring knowledge. So I think in my experience, it's more the need of continue discussing and enhancing the field than, the differences among the stakeholders, countries and sectors.
Hello, my name is Chris Brandt. I'm the program coordinator with CCD, work with Bob. I just came back from Ghana, where I was engaged in a series of meetings with NGOs and the Ministry of Education, going off of the concept of the National Democracy Education Plans that Bob talked about. And what we did was we had a pilot program workshop in Ghana that brought together stakeholders from civil society, from the Ministry of Education, from the legal field, all of the relevant stakeholders to discuss education for democracy and ways of broadening and deepening it, and to undertake a process of actually developing national democracy education action plans, which is a tool that I think is very effective if you have a plan that's set to paper. That can be developed by all of these stakeholders working in collaboration, and can be an important tool for advocacy with civil society. Ghana their Ministry of Education is undertaking a curriculum review process beginning in 2015. So if you have a plan in place, a document in place, it can be an important tool that's used in pushing the Ministry of Education to expand and deepen education for democracy within the education system there. It's also an important tool that can be used by civil society in talking about their programs. And the best practices manual, which Bob talked about, which CCD just published, was a useful tool during this stakeholders meeting that we had, because the manual has introductory chapters by both Matthew Hebert, where he talks about a lot of the concepts that he's discussed with democratic classrooms, student-centered activities within the classroom, kind of modeling democracy within the activities that you talk about. There's also an introductory chapter by David Boyd-Mason, which talks about a lot of the signposts of democracy and a lot of the substance that should be included in any curriculum. And then we have 20 case studies from around the world, which highlight, I think, student-centered, dynamic activities, which I think it just provided a good reference point at the meeting that was used by all the stakeholders, in which you can adapt the ideas within the book to your specific cultural context and educational context. So I think the book is very useful in any process, and can be used by be used by civil society. It can be used by ministries of education. So it's a very flexible and adaptable book. So I'm plugging our product. So it's available outside. Please take a copy.
Please take a copy before you leave. Okay.
Brief logistics comment. If you're from SIS, if you have a class at 2:30, it would not be rude for you to leave before 2. This session, you're welcome to stay. You're encouraged to stay. The session goes another 15 or 20 minutes. Thanks.
Yes. Gentleman in the back.
Hi, Ira Strauss. I'm with the Democracy International. I was with CCD in 1983 to 4, which is going a long time back, and edited your publication way back then when it was getting started. I have a couple questions. This reminds me a lot of what we talked about in the 60s when I was a kid about democratizing the classroom. We had a huge impact through the movement then. And I think the generous way to put it would be that it did a little bit of good but considerable harm to American education. So the first question would be, how are we going to make sure that we're going to do better and not worse this time if we're just going to carry it further? But the more fundamental question behind that is that all this assumes, as all the organizations I've worked in a sense assume, that democracy is a good thing. Yet, those of us who work on it know that the successful and stable democracies of the world have been formed by trying to make sure that democracy would be a good thing rather than the bad thing it had often turned out to be in previous history. And that involved putting a lot of restrictions on democracy so it would work better. Rather than saying the only cure to the problems of democracy is more democracy, the cure was found in much more limited and balanced democracy. So my question is really, we're having a brief session here today. We can't examine, is democracy a good thing? Did you examine that question of whether more democratization is a good thing in existing democracies, or whether it could undermine the compromises and balances that have enabled democracy to function more or less well?
I'm sure some of the other panelists would like to comment as well, but I'll take a first crack. Really great questions, and I think they're really important questions, and they speak to the kind of process that at least I'm advocating when I talk about democratizing classrooms, because I don't mean making classrooms more liberal, making them more open and free and more dancing around. I'm, there have been a lot of failed experiments in education, and since the 60s, you asked how we can make it better this time. Well, we've got half a century of increasingly rigorous research about how brains work, how people learn, what is good education, and so I think we've come a long ways in the educational literature. But the reason I like so much your questions is because they problematize these very issues. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I'm talking about democratizing education, is problematizing concepts in the classroom, helping children, giving them the opportunities to exercise their brain meat so that they don't go through adolescence with soft skulls. Truthfully, and this requires us to give them opportunities to dig into some of these difficult issues and to exercise their rhetorical skills, their discursive skills, to deliberate together with one another, and to build up those kind of muscles that you need for a healthy functioning democracy. And just so happens that in the process of practicing that day after day, year after year, well, we're almost guaranteed to be spitting out more democratically engaged citizens at the other end of our education system. So I'll leave it there to give the other panelists a chance to respond, but really great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the education for democracy is more of a process and a voyage as opposed to sort of a final destination that everybody arrives at and the landscape looks the same. I think the landscape's going to look differently. I think there's internal contradictions not only within democracy principles but within human rights principles. So I think street law, at least in our educational methodology, sees the process of considering open-ended and difficult questions related to global democratic values as something worthwhile for reasons I think that Matt is mentioning, and doesn't really contemplate any kind of one-size-fits-all, oh, you're there, or you're not there, or you're 80% of the way there. I think there's important cultural overlays and important contradictions within the way our own democracy as well as others work. So it's not so clear what the right answers are, but oftentimes it's clearer that there are some right questions to be thought about. And we think that kind of thing is worthwhile in the classroom.
Yeah, this is a very complex issue because what we have learned is that not only is there a need for democratic classroom, but there's a need for a democratic context. We've found that in some countries where kids come from authoritarian families, it doesn't do that much good to have a democratic classroom because they're going to go home and they're going to be told what the verities are by their parents, and who will insist on certain standards of conduct, and the possibilities for their choosing other paths are very limited. I want to cite an example that we uncovered recently. The mayor of Bogota, Colombia, reached out to Palermo, Italy, where the former mayor of Palermo had decided that the mafia was so deeply rooted in Sicilian society that it took a profound effort to educate kids that there were other ways of getting justice than on the street through thuggery, and that the system of justice in Italy today worked more or less well, whereas it didn't 50 years ago when the mafia was thriving, and sought to learn the lessons of how this was taught in the Italian schools so that they could learn it for the Colombian schools to eliminate violence. I think that's an example of how deeply rooted these things are and how complex they are, and how you try to get at them, and whether you're successful or not, it's not very easy. I wanted to give Rebecca a chance to say something about our experience in Colombia, where we came back a week ago from a week where we looked at efforts at democracy education there.
Thank you so much, Bob. And, of course, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. The discussion has been fantastic. So in addition to the pilot project in Ghana, we've actually also done one in Colombia, which has a completely different context. And, to speak about building education for democracy in the context that's best for your own country, Colombia is a fantastic example. There are programs that focus on peace education as a primary component of democracy education because at this moment Colombia is in the midst of negotiating peace, and because violence has been a problem for the country for so many years. And we also had the opportunity to speak with civil society, the Ministry of Education, and, as Bob mentioned, the Office of the Secretary of Education for Bogota, though the former mayor, Mocus, was actually the one who was able to get in touch with the Italians. But, again, we just found that I'll borrow Romina's words, a very promising example of a country that has adapted its democracy education programs at all different levels. It's a very decentralized system for its own context.
Thank you. My name is Aaron Abarna. I'm with USAID. Romina brought up the question of evaluation, and I would like to know what your standards are for evaluating these programs. How do you know they work? What challenges you face in terms of evaluation? And, your outcomes of interest, whether you find significant variation on across gender, income levels, ethnic, linguistic minority groups, in terms of whether service learning projects work better than sage on the stage style teaching methods. Thanks.
Let me just say this will be our last question. Romina?
Well, we have evaluations about our program itself, but I think you are asking about particular experiences. Like, for example, they describe the programs, policies, and projects. I cannot speak. We have a policy brief that, for example, my colleagues have here to distribute about evaluation and First of all, the main challenge, and I think this is shared, governments and civil society organizations, that there's lack of funding, for implementing evaluations. First of all, then besides the lack of funding is the training. How you have, the people trained to develop different types of evaluation. And there's no single approach. You can be quantitative, qualitative. You have to evaluate carefully what type, of evaluation methods you are going to use. And also if you are going to evaluate impact, or if you are going to evaluate process, if you are going to evaluate results. So you have to have people trained at different levels. The people that goes in the field, for example, for a survey, to deal with the students, with teachers, and also people that plan that. I can recommend, for example, the work of the International Evaluation Association, which in 2009 developed the last International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, in which 6 countries from Latin America, Chile, Colombia, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and Mexico participated in that evaluation. And there's a regional model. It's an international model, and then there's a regional model where you can see specific questions that were developed for these countries. It was an attempt to be a kind of regional standard. The next study that they are trying the same with the financial assistance of the Inter-American Development Bank, to develop that kind of standards. And for example, our online course on promoting transparency and integrity with the Inter-American Development Bank is based on one of the main findings of that 2009 study that that has to do, for example, with corruption. And what happened, and also there are other particular questions that are interesting. If you can read, I can give you a particular reference on that study. But I think that those are the main challenges: the funding, the training, and from there solve them. Then we can follow up.
Yeah, in the United States, there is a 2-year-old study called Guardians of Democracy, which is a meta-analysis of promising practices related to effective democracy education programs. And it's a short, relatively short, and accessible study. It is U.S.-focused, which may have limited value in other places, but it looks at the characteristics of civic and democracy education programs that work in the U.S. And it's promoted by an organization called the Civic Mission of Schools, which is a national movement in the U.S. to try to rekindle the traditional and historic civic mission of schools. And I'd be glad to send anybody the study. It's called Guardians of Democracy.
Oh, just quick thing. Following up on my answer, I remember something that it's difficult also to measure. For example, there are community programs, for example, service learning programs. And the more problematic thing is how you measure the impact in community, because you say you work, for example, with community, but how you can measure not only, for example, if students are more aware, if they are more informed, if they participate more in community, how the community received that, and for example, if you through your action improve the community, and in which ways. So that's a challenge, for example, for service learning programs that I.
Okay. With that, I think we'll conclude. And I want to let everybody know that the video of this event will be available on IFES.org by tomorrow, should you want to refer back to it. I want to thank our panelists for really excellent presentations and the audience for your participation, and wish you a very good day, and be careful going out there in the cold.